This presentation will address the use of separable and inseparable phrasal verbs. Drop me off. Pick me up. Turn it up. Turn it over. Look it up. Put it away. These are commands or requests that you probably hear almost every day, and they're separable phrasal verbs. These are called separable phrasal verbs because they can be separated. Turn in your homework, or turn your homework in. While matching meaning for phrasal verbs will be very important for you, it will ultimately be more important that you're able to use these separable and inseparable phrasal verbs by the end of this unit. For example, let's say that your teacher asked you, "What do you do if you don't know what a word means?" You wouldn't want to just raise your hand and then shout out, "Look up!" I know that if I heard someone shout, "Look up!" this is what I would do. Okay, let's look more closely at what the real problem here is. The original question asks, what do you do if you don't know what a word means? If I were asked this question, I would answer with, I look it up. And it here is referring to our object, a word. So I look it up. You've got a subject, you've got a verb, and an object here. It would be redundant or repetitive to say I look up the word, because in this case we already know it's a word since it is in the question, embedded. Therefore we just say I look it up. Okay, let's rewind here first. Look up has two meanings, and it's important that you know both of them. The first meaning has to do with finding the meaning of a word, for example, or finding information. So we're thinking about a search engine or possibly a dictionary. So to look up a word in a dictionary or to look up a word online. And the second use of the verb is more of a literal use, meaning to point your head towards the sky or point your head towards the ceiling and actually look up, which is why we call it a literal meaning. So of these two meanings, can you guess which one is separable? I'm guessing that you chose the first option. Of course we can say, I look up the word, but what would be another way of ordering or organizing this sentence? Can you think of any? Hopefully, I look the word up. So that's another option. And as you're probably aware, we could also say, I look it up. But now, can I do this? And say, I look up it. This would actually be ungrammatical. Now remember, earlier I mentioned that this is okay, to say, I look up the word. And yet, the second sentence here, I look up it, is ungrammatical. Can you think of a rule or a reason for why this is ungrammatical? And this is grammatical? How are these two sentences different? I'm guessing that you mentioned that it was a pronoun. And since it is a pronoun, it cannot come after a separable phrasal verb, such as look up. Can a pronoun go in between a verb and a particle? Yes, that we can do. As we mentioned earlier, it would be fine to say, I look it up. However, we just can't say, I look up it. Now if we go back and look at the phrasal verbs that we saw early in the presentation, such as drop me off, pick me up, put it away, turn it up, turn it over, look it up. Now you might look at this and see that we've got the words me and we've got the words it in all of these examples. What kind of a word is me or it? I'm guessing that you chose pronoun, and you'd be right. So you've got the pronouns me and it separating these separable phrasal verbs. So remember that for separable phrasal verbs, you always have a verb and a particle, and they can be separated. And what goes in between? What goes in between the verb and the particle? If you said either a noun or a pronoun, you'd be correct. Just as we talked about earlier, examples such as turn it on, you've got your verb, you've got your pronoun, and you've got your particle. Now that we've talked about separable phrasal verbs, let's take a look at inseparable phrasal verbs. You might be looking at this picture and laughing and thinking, what do handcuffs have to do with inseparable phrasal verbs? Let's think of it this way. Imagine that the left hand here represents a verb, and let's imagine that the right hand represents a particle. Your verb and your particle can't be separated, because just like the word inseparable, in means not or opposite of. So that means that you cannot separate your verb and your particle, and so the image that I think of is two hands stuck together, they cannot be separated. Let's take a look at a specific example. If come across means encounter or find, and you said, I came across a new word yesterday, that would be the correct way of using the phrasal verb. Came across must appear together with your verb and your particle together here. These cannot be separated. Therefore, would it be possible to say, I came a new word across? No, it wouldn't, because came across would need to appear together because it's an inseparable phrasal verb. So now let's review. We have separable phrasal verbs and we have inseparable phrasal verbs. Turn on and turn off are good examples of separable phrasal verbs. Remember that separable means that it can be separated, but it doesn't need to be separated. For example, I turned on my computer, or I turned my computer on. The second example, I turned off my computer, or I turned my computer off. Run into is a good example of an inseparable phrasal verb. And remember that with inseparable phrasal verbs, the verb and the particle cannot be separated. So for example, if you decided to say, I ran into an old friend, that is your only choice. You could not say, I ran an old friend into. Now let's wrap up with a story. Let's say that your friend has a car and you don't. So you call him up to ask him for a ride. And you ask him, can you pick up me? Now your friend will understand you fine and probably say, sure, no problem. But now that you know a little bit about how phrasal verbs work, separable and inseparable, you'll know why you shouldn't say this and you should say the second example. This is just one example of ways that you can look at your own language and your use of phrasal verbs and begin to improve your grammar in English. At this point, you should have a pretty good understanding of what separable and inseparable phrasal verbs are, and I hope that now you're excited about how to use them in listening, reading, speaking, and writing.